Teacher report, teacher report, teacher report. Learn about feudal life, kings, lords, serfs, and knights. The Pope and King thought they were both right. The king was made to wait outside. The Vikings made river raids, and European knights went out on crusade. Teacher report, teacher report. Mariners at ease, here's our next adventure. All right, welcome back. Today we're talking about the later half of the Middle Ages. Remember, Middle Ages, what? Give me a date here. Beginning, end, what are you thinking? 500 to 1500. Okay, good job. We'll talk about the Magna Carta. It's sort of like the great-grandfather or the great-great-grandfather of the U.S. Constitution. So that means it's going to be important. We'll talk about it. Parliament, you should know what a parliament is. Don't worry if you don't know the details, you'll be okay. 100 Years' War, I think it was 116 years long, but in history, 100 years close enough. Joan of Arc, you should have read a little bit about the Black Death. So if I say the Black Death, you know right away what that was, right? It's a plague that ravages Europe. Spanish Inquisition, here we go. Course objectives, the Magna Carta, important political document. I say again, it's going to start, the people wanting some of the power. It's going to start restricting what the monarchy or the king can do. And these restrictions written down, that's the first time it's ever really written down. And then that's going to continue throughout time. A few hundred years later, you get the U.S. Constitution. And so this is like the great-grandfather. Black Death, Deadly Plague, Spanish Inquisition. People are punished if you're not a Christian. Feudal System, fill in the chart from top to bottom. Ready, set, go. Perfect. Kings, lords, knights, serfs. Perfect. Oh, I have nobles written down. That's fine. That's fine. What do they want? Land. What do you have to do to earn that land? You have to do some type of work. Okay, very good. Okay, so the Magna Carta. This is the first document to limit the power of the king. It protects people's rights. It says you can't just throw me in, before this document, and the further you go back in time, think about the Pharaoh. He is God on earth. He can do whatever he wants, okay? Now, you're going to have kings. They can just throw you in jail or say you're guilty. They're judge, jury, executioner. This document says we need a trial. We need some due process, things like that. Here's a funny and a quick video about the Magna Carta.
This may look like a plain, unassuming piece of parchment, but is actually one of the most famous documents in the world. Magna Carta, meaning the Great Charter, has inspired people across the centuries, from Thomas Jefferson to Mahatma Gandhi. But why was the Charter originally created, and what does it actually say? Let us take you back to medieval England. It's the year 1215, and the ruler is King John. Many people believe that King John was one of the worst kings in history. He imprisoned his former wife, he starved his opponents to death, he allegedly murdered his own nephew, and pulled the beards of the Irish chiefs. King John had imposed heavy taxes on his barons in order to pay for his expensive foreign wars. If they refused to pay, he punished them severely or seized their property. The barons demanded that King John obey the law. When he refused, they captured London and John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede in June 1215. The result of the negotiations was written down by the king's clerks into the document we know as Magna Carta. Although most of the Charter's clauses dealt with medieval rights and customs, Magna Carta has become a powerful symbol of liberty around the world. The most famous clause which is still part of the law today, for the first time gave all free men the right to justice and a fair trial. No man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one will we sell. However, this clause was not as liberal as it sounds. The Charter only applied to free men. The vast majority of people in 1215 were unfree peasants who were ruled over by their landowners. And although Magna Carta was intended to create peace between King John and his rebellious barons, England was plunged into civil war after the Pope declared the Charter invalid. When King John died of dysentery in 1216, 9-year-old Henry III took to the throne. To keep the peace, Magna Carta was reissued several times during the 13th century, until it was finally made part of English law. Magna Carta has lived on for 800 years and is echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps Magna Carta's most important legacy is that everyone, including our leaders, must obey the law. What started out as a document of specific complaints from a group of barons has turned into an international symbol of liberty, without which we might not have the rights we value so much today.
Okay, welcome back. So we have a presidential system, and we have how many branches of government? 3 branches of government. And what are they? Okay, perfect. Executive, legislative, executive, judicial. You go in the order that the Constitution put them. Legislative, executive, judicial. In a parliamentary system, you really don't have an executive branch per se. You have a legislative body, and then the number one person in that body is the executive. Does that make sense? Don't worry if it doesn't. They don't really have a president. They have a prime minister, but you can change the prime minister relatively easily compared to the president. Listen, if this is over your head, don't worry about it. Just know that at this time you had the king, and now we're starting to see the king lose a little power, and the people are gaining power, and the people are going to exercise that power through a parliamentary system. Okay, here's what it looks like in real life. This is called questions to the prime minister.
Country have faith in a prime minister who can't be bothered to turn up, and when he does, has no shame in defending bullying in his own government.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is the question from a full-time neo-Marxist who's failed to stamp out bullying in his own party. And actually, I'm very proud, as I say, of the record of this government just over the last 82 days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, communities like mine in West Bromwich West are grateful for this government's commitment to 366 police officers for the West Midlands. But would my right honourable friend reaffirm that unlike the Labour PCC, who's decimating communities like mine in Tipton with the closure of our police station, that it's this government who's committed to keep our communities safe through investment in the police and tougher sentences for the criminals that are ruining the lives of my constituents in Tipton.
Thank you very much. And that is precisely why my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is...
All right, welcome back. Okay, so 100 Years' War, the French king dies. By the way, where's the English monarchy traced back to? Do you remember which guy? William the Conqueror. And where was he from? France. Okay, he's the Duke of Normandy. So you've got the French king. He leaves no heir. There's a debate on who wants to rule. They're going to battle this out for a really long time. In the end, a French guy takes over, okay? Just know it's a long battle. You maybe have heard this name, Joan of Arc, okay? So she leads the French army. People rally around her, and they think that she has like a spiritual merit that will carry the day. Here's a quick...
Joan of Arc was a French heroine and Roman Catholic saint, whose victories in the 100 Years' War paved the way for the crowning of Charles VII of France. Joan was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy in Domremy in northeastern France in around 1412. At around the age of 12, Joan is said to have had a vision of 3 saints who told her to drive out the English who had invaded France after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and bring the Dauphin Charles VII back to Reims. At 16, she attempted to obtain permission to visit the French court, but was denied. She then went on to make a prediction about a military outcome at a battle near Orléans, which was confirmed by a local garrison commander, and when her prediction came true, she was granted permission to visit the French court. Joan impressed Charles VII while at court, and she requested to be allowed to travel with the army to relieve the under-siege Orléans. Joan instructed Charles VII that she had been sent by God to lead the army. Despite her being an illiterate farm girl, the French army had suffered many devastating and humiliating defeats, and Charles seemed to have exhausted all other rational options. She arrived at the siege of Orléans in 1429, and began aiding the French army in a much more militarily aggressive campaign, and she was granted co-command of the French army, leading the army to several victories over the English. The victories led to a truce with England, and the Dauphin was crowned, fulfilling Joan's prophecy. The truce with England did not last long, and the English attacked the city of Compiègne in 1430. Joan was captured whilst attempting to defeat the English, and was sold to the English government by the Duke of Burgundy. She was put on trial for heresy in 1431, and was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was burned at the stake, then her ashes were cast into the River Seine. She was just 19. She was retrialed posthumously in 1456, and found not guilty, and was made a saint by Pope Benedict XV in 1920.
Okay, so the consequences of the 100 Years' War is that the king loses even more power in England. We're moving from the monarchy being a total monarchy with unlimited power to losing some of that power, and then eventually the United States is going to kind of stream out of this. Does that make sense? Okay, hundreds of years after this. Where in France, the king actually gets more power. Kind of interesting. So the plague, I have a very narrow range of dates here, but because I think that's what's in your book, but it happens over a long period of time, and it comes and it goes. And I've seen estimates up to 50% of the people die, but I think your book says a third of the population. So lots of people die. As long as you get that, you understand. It's spread by rats. What's the new intel? That it's really the fleas on the rats, and in even other cases, it might have been airborne a little bit. Here's a video about the Black Plague.
Imagine if half the people in your neighborhood, your city, or even your whole country were wiped out. It might sound like something out of an apocalyptic horror film, but it actually happened in the 14th century during a disease outbreak known as the Black Death. Spreading from China through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the devastating epidemic destroyed as much as 1/5 of the world's population, killing nearly 50% of Europeans in just 4 years. One of the most fascinating and puzzling things about the Black Death is that the illness itself was not a new phenomenon, but one that has affected humans for centuries. DNA analysis of bone and tooth samples from this period, as well as an earlier epidemic known as the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, has revealed that both were caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague today. What this means is that the same disease caused by the same pathogen can behave and spread very differently throughout history. Even before the use of antibiotics, the deadliest outbreaks in modern times, such as the ones that occurred in early 20th century India, killed no more than 3% of the population. Modern instances of plague also tend to remain localized or travel slowly, as they are spread by rodent fleas. But the medieval Black Death, which spread like wildfire, was most likely communicated directly from one person to another. And because genetic comparisons of ancient and modern strains of Yersinia pestis have not revealed any significantly functional genetic differences, the key to why the earlier outbreak was so much deadlier must lie not in the parasite, but the host. For about 300 years during the High Middle Ages, a warmer climate and agricultural improvements had led to explosive population growth throughout Europe. But with so many new mouths to feed, the end of this warm period spelled disaster. High fertility rates combined with reduced harvests meant the land could no longer support its population, while the abundant supply of labor kept wages low. As a result, most Europeans in the early 14th century experienced a steady decline in living standards, marked by famine, poverty, and poor health, leaving them vulnerable to infection. And indeed, the skeletal remains of Black Death victims found in London showed telltale signs of malnutrition and prior illness. The destruction caused by the Black Death changed humanity in two important ways. On a societal level, the rapid loss of population led to important changes in Europe's economic conditions. With more food to go around, as well as more land and better pay for the surviving farmers and workers, people began to eat better and live longer, as studies of London cemeteries have shown. Higher living standards also brought an increase in social mobility, weakening feudalism and eventually leading to political reforms. But the plague also had an important biological impact. The sudden death of so many of the most frail and vulnerable people left behind a population with a significantly different gene pool, including genes that may have helped survivors resist the disease. And because such mutations often confer immunities to multiple pathogens that work in similar ways, research to discover the genetic consequences of the Black Death has the potential to be hugely beneficial. Today, the threat of an epidemic on the scale of the Black Death has been largely eliminated thanks to antibiotics. But the bubonic plague continues to kill a few thousand people worldwide every year. And the recent emergence of a drug-resistant strain threatens the return of darker times. Learning more about the causes and effects of the Black Death is important, not just for understanding how our world has been shaped by the past. It may also help save us from a similar nightmare in the future.
Okay, if you survived the plague and you were a peasant, how do you feel? What happens? Is it good or bad? Okay, it's good because now there's less, the demand for labor is high, but the supply of labor is low. When you have high demand and low supply, you can charge more money. Okay, so the peasants or the serfs will become more valuable if you survived the plague. Okay, heresy means that your ideas oppose the accepted church teachings. And often if you're labeled a heretic, you're going to be kicked out of the church. What's that word called? Excommunicated. Excommunicated. Perfect. All right. I knew I'd say it eventually. That's all for today. We'll see you back here tomorrow.